As we know from the likes of the Ace class, there are characters and ranks within Hogs of War that were just not used upon final release. So today we're going to be exploring the Architect, which is a rank within the Engineer class that did have some major weapons, abilities, and overall craziness that is basically unlike anything we have seen before. As you guys may have seen, I did talk about this character briefly in my Engineer class bootcamp video, so if you want to check that out, that will of course be linked at the end of this video. So before the likes of the Saboteur, there was the Architect. Now this character sat with 140 health and was the highest rank the player could be within the Engineer class, but for some reason the roster screen also showed this character as having a different name to their in-game rank. So for instance, the Engineer was also called the Staff Sergeant and the Architect was known as a Warrant Officer. Now why was this a thing? I have no idea, but for the sake of future videos I do intend to find out. But as we learned from the Sapper and Engineer, the player was able to physically build objects within a world space, being that of a single wall and a shelter. The main thing that put the Architect above the rest of them though was its ability to build a pillbox. Hogs of War has always been about progression, about being able to improve and upgrade your pigs as you move on through each level. Now the Architect seems to fit into this category of being multi-purpose, as he could provide a small amount of protection for his team by building a wall, expanding on that by being able to build a shelter, and go even further by building a pillbox. It is worth noting that buildings created by this character would affect the shape of the landscape around them, which is indeed an element that we have discussed before and is something that we don't see in today's game. The first thing that does come to mind when you mention the changing of landscape is worms, as destructible landscapes were really a staple of that particular franchise, but Hogs of War never really went with that method. Why? Probably because it was way too tricky to implement and program into the PS1. As you'll recall, Worms 3D came out a few years later on the PS2, which at the time was the next gen console, and so it allowed game developers and programmers to really push the limits of what they could achieve. But either way, I think it's awesome that the idea of being able to change the landscape in some way was being played with at the time, and it really does help mold this character into something that was more than just being a dude with some TNT. The player wouldn't have just been able to build wherever they wanted though. As you can see, they required the necessary space and blueprints in order to lay out their buildings accordingly. Hogs of War does offer plenty of levels where this would have been possible, but you can see where this character's main weaknesses would have been. As we know, positioning is key in this game, so any map that had water would greatly affect the Architect's chances of being able to put up their buildings. In some cases, the spaces available would be near enemy positions, which is never really a suitable situation. In addition, I don't know about you, but I've never really liked the pillbox. Its limited range and unreliable aiming ability puts it far down my list of favourite vehicles, but I suppose it would have worked well for the Architect, seeing as stuff like a tank or an artillery would have been considered excessively overpowered. Alongside providing support for their team, the Architect was also armed with a trotter, the standardized shotgun, some anti-personnel mines, and of course TNT. Explosion. So this rank of pig certainly had ways of dispersing enemies with large health pools, which is not really a change from the Saboteur in today's game. The Engineer class as a whole has always been about high amounts of damage that is inflicted at close range. Now the build ability definitely changes that, as it enables the Architect and other engineers and sappers to almost create a little nest fit with a defensive pillbox and sheltered support. Basically it just allows for the creation of an area for your team to call base camp should you really need it. I do really wish this ability was still in the game, because it adds a completely different element into what the Engineer class could be, rather than just being a high impact and high risk character. Unfortunately, we are unable to know what the damage numbers for the pillbox would have been at this stage in development, but as you can see, the turning speed was much faster. I for one just find it strange how the Architect and indeed other characters within the Engineer class had the ability to build a wall. Like, it's a very specific type of damage that you're going to be blocking there. Against snipers and spies it is perfect for blocking bullets, but against most types of shells that wall would just be blown into pieces. When I look at the Architect, I see it as being the perfect example of what the Engineer class should be. In today's game, they have very individual roles in that the Sapper, the Engineer, and the Saboteur can all go off and do their own thing, and they don't necessarily, physically help the team. By building stuff, that in itself will provide a physical multi-purpose object for your team, whether it be a shelter to provide defense or block incoming damage, a pillbox to then create damage, or just to have a an area on the map to retreat to and use the only current class whose role it is to physically help the team, being that of the medic. It is the orderly, the medic, and the surgeon that have to be hands-on all the time and, really stick with your team. I'm not saying that the engineer class isn't important because, it does provide a lot of damage, it does do a lot for your team overall, but its role is very individual and it doesn't require anybody else unless you get injured and you required some kind of healing, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Overall though, I do like the Architect and how its development could have really shaped this class into being something that is slightly different compared to today's game. But what do you think about this character? Do you think it could have worked? Is the buildability just too overpowered? And why did TNTs have a tendency to slide around at this stage in development? I don't know the answer to that one, but I would love to know what you think. So let me know your thoughts on the Architect in the comments below. Let's get a discussion going as we always do. In the meantime though, I do have lots of upcoming videos regarding Hogs of War, so as always stay tuned, and I will catch you all later for the next one.